Due to the influence of yellow journalism in the late 1800s, the Spanish-American War was declared on April 25, 1898. During hurricane season, the U.S. fleet attacking Santiago needed shelter. Thus, Guantanamo Bay was chosen because of its excellent harbor. On June 6 through June 10 of 1898, the invasion of Guantanamo Bay occurred. The U.S. Navy attacked the harbor and subsequently the U.S. Marines successfully landed. Guantanamo Bay is an inlet on the southeast coast of Cuba. The bay is a great location because it has deep waters and is sheltered from storms. After the Spanish-American War, the U.S. government decided to use the bay as a permanent naval base. The Platt Amendment gave the United States the right to do so. Even though the United States annulled the amendment, it held the right to the naval base in Guantanamo Bay.
When I first arrived in Cuba, we lived in Guantanamo City. We had an apartment on the second floor of a two-family house. We shopped in the market, which was a big open marketplace. Our neighbors were an enlisted couple with 2 children who could not get housing on the base. I was extremely pregnant, and so we got housing on the base. We got Guantanamo Bay. Our first housing was a closet, which is a metal structure. Oval top, quite primitive, but that's where most of the enlisted people lived, and that was the only housing that was available. And then we got a house on the base in a location called Oil Point. There were just officers there, and one house for the maids, because everybody had a Cuban as a maid, and some of them spoke English and some of them didn't.
After the War of Independence, Cuba was in ruins. The country lost 2/3 of its wealth, bridges, railroads, and telegraph lines were destroyed, and sanitary conditions were terrible as a result of the war. A mortal illness, like yellow fever, swept the country as a result of the war as well. In the 1950s, Cuba's middle class consisted of about 1/3 of the population, and 23% of the working class was considered skilled, making Cuba the 3rd highest per capita income of all of Latin America. The median income was between $350 and $550 a year, translating to about $3,000 to about $5,000 today, while the average income in the United States is approximately $46,000 annually. Cuba was a poor country. However, it was not in the same category of poverty as India, Bolivia, Haiti, or Mexico. The gap between living standards in cities like Havana differed vastly from living standards in the countryside. Only 7% of houses in the country had electricity.
Can you tell us who your husband was?
He was the disease vector control officer. He was in the medical corps. And so, off of the base, he had to inspect hospitals, cigar factories, and whorehouses. And on the base, he studied insects. There was a big problem with eye gnats, little gnats that just flew around your eye. It was different between officers and enlisted people. And they really didn't interact, and the wives didn't interact. It was as if we were from 2 different cultures. There were a lot of women. Most of the officers had their wives and children, as did the enlisted men. They could bring their wives. There wasn't enough housing on the base for all enlisted couples, so many of them lived in Guantanamo until conditions in Guantanamo became so bad that they had to move on to the base. They didn't have jobs. They were just wives. And I think I was one of the few wives that had a job. I became pregnant again, and I had a stillbirth. And at that time there was an epidemic of stillbirths on the base, so evidently it was a virus. Officers' wives kept separate from the enlisted wives. And Oil Point there were maybe a dozen houses, and all the people who lived in those houses were friendly. Also, there was the Officers Club, which had a swimming pool and every Sunday night a buffet dinner. And so there was an active social life. First arrived, they were very bad. Batista was in power, who was the dictator. And we were able, after he was ousted and Castro came into power, we were able to drive around and we could see the results of the corruption. There were big roads that led to Batista's house and there were roads that led nowhere. But for the main part, at least in the area of Guantanamo that we live, people were poor.
During the years 1947 through 1991, the Cold War caused military tension, conflict in politics, economic competition, and proxy wars. Much of this tension was between the Soviet Union and the United States. An alliance was made in the mid-1960s between the Soviet Union and Cuba, which was led by Fidel Castro. He came into power in 1959 during the Cuban Revolution. Immediately after coming to power, Fidel Castro attempted to eradicate the United States from the naval base in Guantanamo Bay. He did so unsuccessfully, but still allowed Cuban nationals to work for the U.S. Navy. However, the Cuban Revolution headed towards becoming a Marxist-Leninist political system. Relations between Cuba and the U.S. slowly turned stale and eventually came to an end.
When Castro came into power, people could not get off of the base except for Andy, who had quite a bit of freedom to travel around, but most other people did not. I think it was a wonderful experience. It was a completely different society. The living on the base, it was all mostly social, and because everyone had help, there was a lot of drinking, there was a lot of, and coming back to the States was a dose of reality, where you actively took care of your child, you did your own errands, you did your own, and you weren't surrounded by people constantly. We came back to a very different situation than we had when we left. When we left, we had been students, and when we came back, we were professionals. I was always independent, and I was the one who worked before other women worked, and I retired when other women started to work. I think that's the big difference, that we suddenly became a two-income, everybody became two-income families, and so people were living very differently than the wife staying home and taking care of the house and the man being the breadwinner. Cuba was much more primitive, at least the areas of Cuba that we were in. Andy inspected the hospitals, and the patient's family had to bring them food. They just weren't as advanced as we were. And then Andy was back maybe 5 years ago, and they still weren't as advanced.
And this is a box of cigars, but what's even more interesting about this box of cigars is that's Fidel Castro's signature.
About 6 years ago, Judy's husband Andy returned to Cuba once again. Andy and a few others had the privilege of dining with the Cuban president at the time, Fidel Castro. Castro was a heavy drinker and smoker. The men drank and celebrated until 1 in the morning, when dinner was finally served. Andy returned with a photograph of him and Castro, along with a one-of-a-kind signed box of Cuban cigars, which is now in the possession of his son.